Pink-haired woman addressed the viewer and urged listeners to answer her call. She promised change and framed the chance as a new beginning for hopeful recruits. A massive billboard repeated the slogan "Your story starts now" and advertised the Hero Association to the city. The year was given as 20XX, and panels showed cities under monstrous assault. Citizens endured, and some humans developed power that manifested as raw force. Those people organized into a new order and were sorted by rank into S, A, B, C tiers. A triumphant hero image followed, and media amplified their rise. The narrative then shifted to reveal a production set where a film crew filmed the heroes. The director called cut, and the camera stopped. The pink-haired woman stood on the set and addressed the lens with quiet uncertainty. The pink-haired woman held her face and stared through the lens. A dark thought cut through her, and she denied it with a whisper. An on-set crew member laughed and praised the take as camera lights exploded. Spotlights and flashes framed the set while the director called it perfect. She posed in costume and smiled as the on-set crew filmed promotional shots. A small child watched on a screen and mimicked her. Her hands flared with light in a practiced heroic gesture. Promotional art showed her with a staged hero team. Then the scene shifted to pain, blood-torn flesh, and screams. Monster hands dragged at her while she screamed and bled. The pink-haired woman had posed moments before under camera lights and applause. The scene then snapped to blood and panic as a monster attacked without mercy. A wounded person writhed, pleaded hurry, and begged someone to heal them. The monster's wounds gaped and then knit, gore folding into living flesh. Panels cut to a sterile room where a woman in white held a bloody head. Text boxes explained a partner's fall and the horror of transformation. Footsteps followed, then an ow as someone stepped on a sore toe. Finally, the cap figure appeared casual and defiant, a cap pulled low. The pink-haired woman bent closer and gasped at the small animal before her. The creature filled the panel with round eyes and a jangling bell. The bell's engraving read stronger and drew her gaze outward. She then looked up at the building sign, which matched the bell's word. A distant voice off-panel barked an order about lifting the butt. Her expression hardened as hands moved in suddenly to grab or steady her. She braced against the unexpected contact while the cat remained calm. The moment cut between wonder and an abrupt command. The pink-haired woman bent and gasped at a tiny animal set low in the frame. The creature fixed her with round eyes and a jangling bell engraved stronger that drew her glance outward to a matching sign. A sharp off-panel order about lifting the butt cut the moment. Hands moved in to steady her, and she braced against the sudden contact. A man then stepped forward wearing a tiger-printed shirt and offered calm reassurance while the woman stared in stunned silence. The sequence closed on the small cat posed like it owned the room. The pink-haired woman bent and gasped at a tiny animal near the floor. The creature stared back with round eyes and a bell that read stronger. That bell drew glances to a matching sign. An off-panel order about lifting her but abruptly interrupted the moment. Hands moved in to steady her, and she braced under the contact. A man in a tiger-printed shirt stepped forward and offered calm reassurance. Others fussed and passed food. She promised an easy lemon squeeze as the atmosphere shifted. The sequence ended on a wide, predatory grin and the letters PT. The instructors cued a rapid sequence of strength drills across the gym floor. A muscular trainer barked squat counts while a costumed actor matched every motion. Attention shifted quickly to heavy deadlifts, followed by an emphatic bench press challenge. Voices pushed timing and hissed corrections as the group strained through reps. Someone ordered a 1-minute break, and the athletes tightened their pace. A phone on a nearby bench began to beep with increasing urgency. The pink-haired woman looked up from her cap and met the sound. Her glasses flared with sudden burning light, which halted the action briefly. The trainers had pushed the class through hard sets before a monster alarm banner appeared. The pink-haired woman's phone flared and she lifted it, eyes catching the alert. She held the device and hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. Doubt tightened her jaw and she almost backed away. A dark-haired man stepped forward and asked if she would go, his voice steady. He urged her to choose and then moved to stand. She clenched her teeth, weighed the option, and stayed long enough to gather herself as he headed for the exit. She had hesitated over the phone and watched the other man leave. A man lingered on a bench and a cord swung near closed doors. Then a distant thud drew every eye and the ground began to break. People fell and shouted for help as debris tumbled into the street. The pink-haired woman sprinted across rubble and leapt toward the collapse. A massive maw tore through concrete and a monstrous roar filled the air. She met the creature's gaze, forced her voice, and moved to act. Bystanders scrambled and panic spread among ragged cries. She had hesitated and watched people flee as the ground split and debris fell. The pink-haired woman sprinted over rubble and faced the monster's maw. She forced her voice and begged the crowd to run toward safe streets. Some bystanders stumbled away while one wounded person lay under cracked concrete. The monster lunged with a clawed arm and closed on the heroine. She shouted please and pushed toward the danger to shield others. The creature struck her with brutal force and knocked her onto broken stone. Dust rose and the scene collapsed into a single desperate cry. The pink-haired woman found herself stunned that she had moved despite fear. She saw the monster barreling through the street and a wounded bystander beside her. She shouted for people to run and pushed the injured toward safety. When the monster lunged, she stepped forward to block its claw and protect others. Pain flared, but she struck the creature with a raw fist and landed a blow. The monster reeled and slammed into rubble, scattering debris and breaking pavement. Dust and screams filled the ruined avenue as the scene held a fragile stillness. The pink-haired woman stared and whispered in confusion. A bystander pointed and announced that an alpha male had arrived. Jim Guy stepped forward with a smug grin and joked about the bathroom placement. The crowd's attention shifted to him. The monster then tore into the scene with a sudden strike. It slammed into the crowd and struck Jim Guy hard. He tumbled and began to bleed. The pink-haired woman cried out and braced herself. Debris and dust filled the ruined avenue as panic spread among onlookers. The monster lunged through the ruined avenue and struck the crowd. It slammed into Jim Guy and knocked him to the ground. A shirtless man tried to push himself up but bled and lost strength. The monster tore into another bystander and showed its teeth. Punches and debris flew as fighters collided and tumbled. The pink-haired woman watched in mounting horror and shouted that she could not see. The crowd panicked and scattered. Someone whispered that this attacker was no ordinary person. Dust and fragments filled the air as the scene spiraled into chaos. The monster grabbed and hurled a man through concrete and rubble downward. Bodies and debris rained as bystanders cried and scrambled for nearby cover. A bleeding man tried to rise but collapsed beneath the force again. The monster bared teeth and spat cruel insults at its fallen prey. Someone screamed obscene threats while another hand clenched the air menacingly. The pink-haired woman shielded a child and held a nearby woman close. She stared at the monster and announced that he would never win. The monster snarled and began to answer, but faltered when she smiled. The monster grabbed a man and hurled him through concrete and debris below. Bystanders scrambled for cover as dust and cries filled the air again. A bleeding man tried to rise, but collapsed under the monster's renewed assault. The pink-haired woman shielded a child and clutched the local woman to her side. She declared the monster would never win and forced a smile at him. Jim Guy lunged from the smoke, reaching with raw strength toward the monster. He struck the monster with full force and forced it to reel backward. The pink-haired woman stared in shock as the scene shifted toward rescue and violence. The sequence ended on a bright promotional splash, celebrating a subscriber milestone. The monster taunted its opponents and seized another man, hurling him through concrete and rubble. Bystanders recoiled as dust and metal fell. Jim Guy surged from the smoke and struck the monster with raw force, forcing it to stagger. Onlookers froze while sirens wailed beyond the wreckage. A bright promotional splash interrupted the chaos and framed a celebratory milestone. The calm shattered moments later as the monster lunged back. The pink-haired woman crumpled under a final blow and whispered an apology into the ruined air. The monster seized another man and hurled him through concrete and metal debris. Bystanders recoiled while dust and jagged fragments rained over the ruined street. Jim Guy surged from the smoke and struck the monster with brutal force. Sirens wailed beyond the wreckage as a bright promotional splash briefly cut through chaos. The monster lunged and slammed into the pink-haired woman, who collapsed and whispered apology. An ally cried for healing and channeled a cold, crystalline wave toward the creature. The blast struck the monster as faces registered shock and a fragile spark of hope. The monster grabbed a man and hurled him through twisted concrete and jagged metal. Bystanders recoiled as dust and fragments rained over the ruined street below. Jim Guy surged from smoke and struck the monster with brutal force. Sirens wailed beyond the wreckage while a promotional splash cut briefly through chaos. The monster lunged and slammed into the pink-haired woman, who collapsed whispering an apology. The pink-haired woman then screamed, "Hey, you lizard," at the beast with raw fury. The monster bared its teeth and roared as blood sprayed from its maw. A wounded man gasped and clung to consciousness amid collapsing concrete and rubble. After the wounded man clung to consciousness, voices cut through the smoky wreckage. A nearby voice insisted it was not her fault, then urged her to stop. She sobbed and spat an apology while tears tracked down her face. The monster slammed a man into the rubble as dust and sparks flew. A desperate plea of please rose from the broken heap. The pink-haired woman's eyes flared pink, and she unleashed a focused energy blast. It struck the monster and nearby structures with shattering force and light. Debris rained as the explosion carved a bright wound across the skyline. Sirens wailed far off, and the survivors staggered beneath new ruin. After the blast cleared, the monster bared its teeth and lunged again. A muscular figure in tiger-striped pants roared and slammed his fist into the ground, sending shockwaves through the rubble. An aiming mark flared across the pink-haired woman's eyes as her aura swelled. A promotional panel named a symbol a hero before a blooded smile cut the scene. A dark-haired man snarled and declared his fervor, then sprinted into a frenzied assault. Bodies were thrown and dust filled the air. Survivors cowered as the battlefield shifted and the monster crashed under new blows. Rubble still fell into a widening crater as combat paused between blows. Jim Guy seized a ruined column and planted his feet, shouting a bold challenge. He roared and slammed the column forward, striking the monster hard. The creature howled and snapped its maw at empty air. A pink energy sweep cut through the debris and forced the monster backward. Concrete split and dust billowed as bodies tumbled across the scarred ground. Survivors crouched and covered while the attacker staggered from new impacts. The man grinned and laughed amid the ruin, chest heaving from exertion. Rubble still fell as Jim Guy lifted a massive wooden club and shouted a challenge. He swung the club in a broad arc and drove it downward. The blow landed on empty air, then cut through debris. He paused, closing his eyes as a scent reached him. He smiled and clutched a roasted limb, then bit into it. Flesh and grease splattered as he devoured the meat. A hot surge moved through him and his muscles bulged. The nearby monster recoiled and widened its yellow eye. Pink-haired woman watched, shocked, as the ground began to quake. Rubble still fell as Jim Guy lifted a massive wooden club and swung through debris. He paused and bit into roasted meat and felt a hot surge flood his limbs. The monster recoiled and widened its yellow eye while pink-haired woman watched in stunned silence. Jim Guy taunted the monster and offered a taste before charging with the limb. He used the meat as a dumbbell and hammered the monster with crushing blows. The monster staggered and bled as the final strike tore flesh and shattered bone. Dust and fragments rained down while pink-haired woman recoiled from the shock. Jim Guy launched a ferocious assault called the alternate protein blast and struck with enormous force. He ripped through flesh and bone and spread blood across the ground. The monster convulsed and fell while dust and fragments rained down. Pink-haired woman screamed a single command and focused bright healing light in a cross shape. Energy flowed outward from her, and the open wounds began to close. Flesh knit and muscle reformed as blood sealed. The severed limb rewove into pulsing living tissue until it stood whole again amid the debris. Jim Guy launched the alternate protein blast and struck the monster with enormous force. Flesh and bone ripped open and blood sprayed across the ground. The monster convulsed and fell while dust and fragments rattled down. Pink-haired woman screamed a single command and focused bright healing light into a cross. Energy moved outward and the open wounds began to seal. Severed tissue knit and muscle reformed until the limb stood whole among the debris. A final shockwave swept the area and cleared smoke and rubble. The scene closed as a caption read, "Your story, STARTS now." After the last skirmish closed, a bloodied man stretched a hand toward the heroine and asked if that was how she did it. She snapped that moments like these were no time for that. Caption boxes confessed a premonition and noted the whole affair felt different. A document was thrust into frame and hands signed it quickly. A boot crushed a paper-labeled "Girl Start." Her calm shifted to alarm as another man revealed a toothy grin. A tiny figure burst in shouting a new member had arrived, and the panel erupted into frantic noise. Pink-haired woman stared wide-eyed and trembling as the moment snapped into dread. A caption acknowledged an ominous prediction, and the narrator agreed with it. The view pulled back to reveal a shattered plaza and deep crater where a huge fallen figure lay. Man 1, Man 2, and Tiny Recruit moved around the rim checking for survivors. The scene felt raw and quiet until a garish billboard cut into frame. The advertisement showed a shirtless man posing with grilled meat and a bright caption. The promotional art jarred against the devastation and left the group unsettled and small. Pink-haired woman kept trembling beneath a loaded barbell while a man barked orders. He demanded discipline and pushed her to lift despite her obvious pain. She clenched her jaw and sobbed as the strain showed on her face. The frame cut to a gaudy advertisement where a shirtless man posed with grilled meat. A separate shot showed a man holding a document and laughing at the crowd. Nearby survivors circled the crater and checked for damage and for people. One man pulled his lips into a cruel wide grin and glared. Suddenly, a heavy barbell flew through the air and struck the ground nearby. Pink-haired woman gasped and collapsed as feet filled the frame above her. Pink-haired woman screamed that she wanted to go home as tears tracked down her cheeks. Her hands trembled and rose in a fragile plea. The world flickered with a monstrous memory that filled her vision and tightened her breathing. A man in shorts entered the frame and tossed a small cat toward her to distract or coax. He offered a water bottle and called for her to drink. She hesitated, then accepted the water, swallowing as the immediate panic loosened. The crowd watched and waited for her next move. The red-haired gym guy offered water and teased that a first time was hard. Pink-haired woman hesitated, then refused the label and said she was not nervous. He checked a prop bag and handed over a costume piece with casual care. She examined her reflection, breath steadying as the crowd waited in silence. He admitted that villain roles were something he envied and grinned afterwards. His smile broke the edge of the scene and softened the audience gaze. The moment shifted from panic toward uneasy calm, but uncertainty remained in her eyes. The earlier calm had frayed but still held as the heroine examined the costume. A grinning man mocked her from the edge of the set and brandished a prop with casual menace. She flinched when something struck the scene with sudden force. Her eyes widened as a shadowed, masked figure loomed and then slammed into the crew. People and equipment were thrown across the floor. Voices rose with alarm, and a frantic shout demanded safety. A wild, snarling man closed on the crowd and hurled obscene taunts. The moment ended in noise and uncertain aftermath. The earlier calm had frayed as pink-haired woman examined the costume and listened. A grinning man mocked her loudly and claimed the kingdom was being crushed. Her face tightened and tears welled as a screaming man hurled obscene taunts. A shadowed cap figure slammed into the set and knocked on-set crew aside. People and equipment flew, and the scene devolved into raw physical violence. An attacker swung hard and drove a smaller person down with brutality. Pink-haired woman flinched and then watched helplessly as bodies scattered and alarms rose. The moment ended in stunned noise and uncertain aftermath on the ruined floor. The earlier calm had frayed and the set remained chaotic. A screaming man yelled obscene taunts while a grinning man mocked the crew loudly. Pink-haired woman declared she was a promotional figure and froze amid the shouting. Alarms began to blare and nearby devices beeped as a holographic panel displayed a public support request for assistance. A costumed hero in a tiger outfit surged into the crowd, smashing props and shattering glass as attackers were knocked aside. On-set crew and bystanders scrambled to safety while dust and debris settled. Two people exchanged looks and a voice asked, "Shall we then?" Momentum carried the scene into urgent action. The earlier on-set chaos had not subsided. Alarms and shouting still echoed across the site. A red-haired man sprinted through falling debris as someone called him a Class B hero. A tiny onlooker squeaked a confused pardon. A colorful advertisement panel flashed briefly amid dust. Green spectral forms emerged from the wreckage and floated between shattered concrete. The runner leapt through collapsing slabs and pressed onward toward the danger. Nearby bystanders exchanged short, uncertain lines, while a blonde voice gasped in disbelief. Pink-haired woman then stepped forward and asked if he truly was the Class B hero. The on-set chaos continued, alarms and shouting still echoed across the site. A bystander brandished a phone and gaped at a handheld commercial image of the heroine. The advertisement showed the pink-haired woman in a staged pose with sparkles and hearts. She stepped forward and met the fan's easy praise with a guarded smile and question. The fan pressed for confirmation and reached to show another glossy pamphlet to her. She pulled away and struck his hand. He yelped and rubbed his palm. A quiet man at the rear turned and asked them to keep voices down. A loud shout rang out and forced heads to swivel in the crowded street. A blonde man glared while the pink-haired woman froze with guarded displeasure. Nearby, a fan brandished promotional photos and urged her for a keepsake image. She withdrew, struck his hand, and walked away under a warning hush from others. A glittering montage of a tiger-costumed performer flashed between moments as fantasy imagery. A leering man later pleaded for her photo in a breathless, unsteady voice. In the distance, the ground gaped, and a lone figure stood beside a faint pink flare. She narrowed her eyes and offered no answer as tension settled over the set. A man seized the pink-haired woman and screamed a curse at her in the crowded space. She fell and tried to answer as he demanded recognition with a wild expression. The scene then shifted to a caption reading "Winter 3 years ago." A grim underground corridor was shown with a no smoking sign and scattered debris. Several youths dragged or carried an injured figure while onlookers argued. A large shirtless man confronted the group and demanded to know why they were there. Tension coalesced around authority and the threatened youths. Earlier, a man had seized the pink-haired woman in the crowded space, and the story then cut to a caption reading "Winter 3 years ago." In a grim underground corridor, youths carried an injured figure while onlookers argued. A large shirtless man confronted them and demanded answers, tension centering on authority. A blonde youth stepped forward and offered a shaky apology, calling someone Hyung. The dark shirtless man watched without mercy, then suddenly struck the youth across the face. The blow knocked him down and silenced the group, leaving fear and control settled in the corridor. Earlier, the pink-haired woman had been seized in the crowd, and the story then cut back. 3 winters earlier, youths carried an injured figure through a grim underground corridor. Onlookers argued while a shirtless man confronted them and loudly demanded answers. A blond youth stepped forward and offered an apology, calling someone Hyung. The dark man watched, then struck the youth hard across the face. The blow dropped him and silenced the group with fear and control. Vomit pooled on the floor and blood smeared across the youth's face. They gagged and bound him while the corridor remained tense and emptied. The sequence then cut to a bright daylight scene with smiling strangers outside. Earlier, the crowd had seized the pink-haired woman, and the story had cut away. 3 winters earlier, youths carried an injured figure down a grim underground corridor. A dark man asserted control with a strike that silenced the group and bound the youth. The scene then shifted back to a heated confrontation in daylight. A captive spat insult, and a hand was forced into a tight restraint. A grinning figure taunted that he had matured and had finally found his target. He shouted a technique name and ignited a roaring cigarette flame that tore upward. Flames consumed the space, and a bystander gasped the name Horse King. The attacker advanced through fire and struck with brutal speed, leaving silence behind. A brutal strike sent a man spinning through scorched air and shrapnel. Tendrils or debris shredded the sky as he tumbled far from the fighting. A close view then showed a battered face gasping a fractured name. The frame cut away to a shoreline where a lone muscular man stood shirtless. A woman with a cap watched him and offered a blunt remark about ease. Attention then swung to the Heart King, who struck a theatrical pose with hearts. He asked if fate had brought them together and basked in the reaction. A brutal strike had already sent a man tumbling through scorched air and shrapnel. On the shoreline, the lone shirtless man had stood while a cap-wearing woman watched. The Heart King then approached with theatrical flourish and seized the shirtless man suddenly. He pressed a loud kiss to the man's mouth and whispered, "Darling." The cap-wearing woman recoiled in horror and shouted for someone to help. The embraced man's face twisted, and he screamed in obvious pain and fear. The Heart King smiled and promised he would make the man feel good again. The cap-wearing woman spun and sprinted forward to pull the man free. After the Heart King's assault, the wounded man lay convulsing on scorched sand. The pink-haired woman knelt and felt for a pulse with trembling hands. He coughed and tried to speak, but blood blurred his mouth. She gripped his shoulders and prepared to drag him away when someone crashed past yelling. The man's eyes widened with pain, then hardened with rage. He screamed through blood and heat, and a blaze burst from his body. Flames spiraled up and licked the shore as he roared for destruction. The pink-haired woman stared, horrified, and begged him to stop as fire wrapped him. Following the Heart King's assault, the wounded man convulsed on scorched sand. The pink-haired woman knelt and checked his pulse with trembling hands. He coughed blood and tried to speak while she gripped his shoulders, dragging him. A figure crashed past yelling, and the man's pain hardened into furious resolve. Heat burst from his body, and flames spiraled up, wrapping the shore in fire. The pink-haired woman begged him to stop as flames licked the ground. She accused him of starting the violence and demanded he show shame. He snapped back and shouted accusations, calling it attempted murder. He flared with power and vowed to stop her by force. She answered that she would stop him herself as a hero. After she vowed to stop him, the Heart King lunged and hurled insults at the pink-haired woman. He cursed her appearance and then unleashed a blast of burning force. She twisted aside and rolled away while flames swept past her body. The Heart King suddenly crumpled and then oozed molten gold across the pavement. She recoiled as his form collapsed into a living pool of fire. He rasped a final taunt from deep inside the molten heap. The pink-haired woman called to him and took a guarded step forward. The molten mass continued to shift and hiss as steam rose from the ground. After the Heart King's collapse, the monster's teeth filled the frame as it rasped and begged for it. Its maw opened wide and molten flesh dripped and hissed from its lips. The creature demanded the missing object with a ragged voice and frantic gestures. It reared and reached massive hands toward the pink-haired woman standing firm. She stepped back cautiously while the Heart King's molten remains pooled at her feet. Steam rose and the monster pleaded again, searching the heroine for the thing it wanted. After the Heart Kings collapsed, the monster loomed with dripping molten jaws and rasping demands. It scanned the area and reached toward the pink-haired woman repeatedly and aggressively. She stepped back and kept the Heart King's remains carefully between them. The monster surged and released a column of blazing molten energy at her. She flinched and then moved, dodging as the blast slammed into the ground. Molten shards scattered, and a burning shockwave distorted the air around them. The monster's eyes suddenly focused, and it hissed a single name softly. It then formed a glowing molten sphere and clenched it in its maw. After the Heart King's collapse, the monster struck its molten sphere into the plaza. The impact tore through a nearby building and sent fire spilling across balconies. Civilians screamed and fell back as molten shards rained and windows shattered. The pink-haired woman stepped forward, keeping the Heart King's remains between them. She dodged embers, then thrust her hand outward while the air warped around it. A gilded name card appeared identifying her as the S-rank ex-hero Yura. Bystanders gasped and the monster snarled while small golden creatures recoiled in fear. After the Heart King's fall, the plaza filled with fire and shattered glass. Civilians scrambled as molten fragments rained and balconies burned. The pink-haired woman stepped forward, shielding the Heart King's remains. She dodged embers, then thrust her hand outward as the air warped. A gilded name card announced her as the S-rank ex-hero Yura. Small golden creatures around them recoiled in visible fear. The monster lunged its molten limb, and the plaza trembled. Yura formed a spiraling crimson pillar that wrapped the limb. The column rotated and compressed the molten mass, forcing the monster to roar. The monster staggered, then collapsed as the pillar weakened and broke. After the Heart King's fall, the plaza burned and glass littered the ground. Civilians scrambled as molten fragments rained and balconies smoldered. Yura stepped between wreckage and the beast, then formed a spiraling crimson column that crushed the monster's molten limb and forced it to collapse. Flames and shards erupted outward, and small golden creatures fled. Her expression shifted to a sharp smile as survivors registered the change. A gray-haired woman called out while a crouched figure hesitated. A towering man then launched himself, seized two attackers, and slammed them down with brutal force, ending the immediate threat. Pink-haired woman shouted, then softened as survivors began to breathe again. A gray-haired figure, Yura, listened while a fellow soothed the Horse King. A shirtless man was held closely by the pink-haired woman, eyes full of strain. He admitted he had been scared and barely reached them in time. A close hurt look hardened into focus as strange light gathered in the street. A woman burst into a dark form, crackling with energy, and stepped forward. Her strike then slammed into the gathered group, bright shards and blood spattered. Pink-haired woman shouted and then soothed the survivors as they breathed again. Yura stood aside and listened while another tended the Horse King. A shirtless man clung to the heroine and admitted he had been scared. Light gathered in the street, and a woman hardened into a crackling dark form. Her strike hit the group with shards and blood. A monstrous mass surged from the impact and vomited living ooze. The heroine leapt and carried the wounded away as golden tendrils swept past. The wounded thanked her and she smiled. Moments later, a furious eye opened beneath the ruin. Pink-haired woman taunted a nearby onlooker and held the moment in place. A young man suddenly looked up and gasped at the sight. A silver-haired woman sat nearby and fumbled as she tried to name what she saw. The scene fractured when a golden monstrous shape crashed in and a voice screamed for Yura. The monster flailed and then took a heavy hit that sent debris flying. It recoiled and blinked in confusion. Two women then shoved an intruder away and ordered them off the premises without mercy. Pink-haired woman kept up her taunt and froze the crowd's attention. A young man gasped, and a silver-haired woman fumbled names nearby. A golden monstrosity crashed into the set and flailed under a heavy blow. The creature burned and writhed before pink-haired woman ordered a quick freeze. The monster's molten form solidified into jagged rock. A nearby man praised Yura's timing. Yura answered the call, powering up in a red aura and striking a pose. The team held firm as the frozen threat hardened under scrutiny. Pink-haired woman kept the crowd focused with her taunt as the set remained frozen. A young man gasped, and a silver-haired woman fumbled names at the edge. The golden monstrosity had crashed into the stage and then hardened into jagged rock. Yura answered the call, wrapped in a red aura and grinning under a helmet. She loaded glowing ring rounds and laughed as she aimed. The rings launched in a tight volley and struck with a thunderous impact. Rock fractured and molten fragments sprayed. The monster reeled and roared while the team maintained formation around the stalled threat. Yura stepped forward and screamed as she charged the rings inside her gauntlet. She loaded and released a tight volley that glowed with red light. The rings struck the golden carapace and detonated with crushing force. Rock and molten fragments erupted outward and rained across the stage. The monster staggered as massive fractures split its form. Yura pressed the assault and drove a vertical pillar of energy into the wound. The team held its positions while the creature convulsed and bled molten rock. Yura advanced and screamed as she loaded concentric rings into her gauntlet. She fired a tight, glowing volley that struck the golden carapace and detonated with crushing force. Rock and molten fragments erupted outward and blanketed the stage, sending debris across the skyline. The monster staggered as massive fractures split its form. Yura pressed the assault and drove a vertical pillar of energy into the wound. The team held position while the creature convulsed and bled molten rock. Pink-haired woman stepped through dust and issued a sharp declaration that the attack had ended. Yura advanced, loading concentric rings into her gauntlet before she released a scream and fired. Her glowing volley struck the monster's golden carapace and detonated with crushing force. Rock and molten fragments erupted across the stage and blanketed the skyline below. The monster staggered as massive fractures split its form and ash rained. Yura drove a vertical energy pillar into the wound while the team held position. Pink-haired woman stepped through dust and declared the attack finished. She scanned the ruined street and found civilians shaken but alive. A shirtless man waved and called out. She answered briefly, then walked away into the broken towers and silence. After the team subdued the monster, pink-haired woman left the ruined street. She later sat at a communal table with bystanders and the shirtless man from earlier. A roasted pork rested at the center and triggered a squabble when someone called it pig feet. The shirtless man lifted a heavy portion and joked he would force her to eat it for the camera. She reddened and protested when her stomach betrayed her. Teasing spread around the table. She slipped forward and landed against him as the group burst into relieved laughter. After the fight, they gathered at a communal table near the ruined street. Pink-haired woman sat among bystanders and the shirtless gym guy. A roasted pork lay at the center and provoked teasing. Someone called it pig feet and the group laughed. The gym guy lifted a heavy portion. He joked he would force her to eat it for the camera. She reddened and protested as her stomach betrayed her. Teasing spread around the table. She slipped forward and landed against the gym guy amid relieved laughter. He pressed a chunk of meat toward her mouth until she relented. She bit down and tasted the meat. The flavor stunned her into a shocked quiet. After her stunned quiet, she shifted into exaggerated theater. Pink-haired woman struck a flamboyant pose and sang a playful refrain, calling the bite a tango of passion. A close shot showed meat at her lips and her surprised smile as flavor hit. She declared the food truly delicious and yielded to the joy of eating. The shirtless gym guy laughed and encouraged everyone to dig in. Yura and nearby bystanders joined with hungry laughter and loud teasing. The moment dissolved into boisterous camaraderie, and then a bright promotional title card closed the scene. Later, she appeared in a dim training room, surrounded by heavy weights and racks. She sat and exhaled, fingers curling around a barbell as a breath escaped. She rose slowly and stretched, sweat darkening the fabric at her chest. A close shot showed her resolve shifting into wary focus and quiet determination. Suddenly, an unseen foot struck near her head, and the scene snapped tense. Her eye widened as she spun toward the disturbance, hair whipping with motion. The sequence cut to a night corridor where a wounded person groaned under red lights. Voices labored into the dark, and the moment closed on ragged breathing. Pink-haired woman had been in a dim training room, breathing through exertion and sudden tension. An unseen foot struck near her head. A boot landed on a prone figure, and a ragged scream followed. A stranger's wild eyes demanded identity, while a hooded woman begged them to stop her brother. The conflict moved into a narrow corridor, lined with boxes and a lone trolley. Voices traded terse plans about leaving, and a marked parcel passed by. Outside, a woman in a red coat walked away down the street. The hooded woman cried "KNOOO" as pink-haired woman advanced toward a stairwell landing. Pink-haired woman reached the stairwell landing and looked down into a crowded hall. The cult leader struck a triumphant pose in tiger-print underwear as the crowd roared. She flinched at the spectacle while blonde woman hid behind a curtain and traded barbed comments. Red-haired woman smiled and stepped forward. Repeated shouts of "no" and crashing noises erupted from a corridor. The two women peered through a doorway and saw a dark space where a heavy weight slammed down. A shadowed silhouette with glowing eyes stood over a prone figure. The scene ended on ragged breathing and a rising threat. Pink-haired woman had reached the landing and watched the hall descend into chaos. The cult leader shouted, "Go to hell," from the center. Masked followers showed painted faces and surged forward. Screams and crashing sounds ripped from the corridor while a heavy weight slammed down. Pink-haired woman staggered, then clenched a tiny figure in her hand. Fear and resolve crossed her face as the crowd pressed in. A looming attacker swung hard, and the threat closed in beneath ragged breathing. Pink-haired woman reached the landing and watched the hall descend into chaos. The cult leader shouted from the center as masked figures surged forward. Screams and crashing sounds tore from the corridor while a heavy weight slammed down.